Here is Donald Trump. Let's get into to some of the news. Donald Trump announced the other day that both a loophole, and he doesn't. There's no. I mean, I suppose he could ban chokeholds with federal officers, but all he can do is really suggest. Or, I mean, if you really wanted to, they're legislatively, you could withhold funding to police departments if chokeholds are not banned. But here he is making it seem like he's banning chokeholds, but also leaving one big sort of giant gaping loophole. Let's see if you can find what that is.
For example, many believe that proper training might have prevented the tragic deaths of Antoine Rose and Botham Jean. As part of this new credentialing process, chokeholds will be banned, except if an officer's life is at risk. And I will say we've dealt with all of the various departments, and everybody said, it's time. We have to do it. Additionally, we're looking at new advanced and powerful, less lethal weapons to help prevent deadly interactions. New devices are being developed all the time, and we're looking at the best of them.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when tasers were brought in as that new non-lethal thing, and it just ended up becoming basically a torture device. But that aside, how do we determine whether a police officer's life is in danger? Well, the police officer does. And that is exactly the standard now that allows them to fire their weapon.
Right.
They get to choose.
And chokeholds were banned in New York City when Eric Garner was murdered, if I believe. They were already off the table here officially. I don't understand. This is a very, maybe I don't want to get into a small point, but like, how physically are you in danger if you physically are in a position to put someone in a chokehold? How does that even make like literal physiological sense? I don't understand what?
Right. If you have that type of control over somebody, how can you argue that you are threatened? And I guess the argument is like, you never know.
Well, that is always the argument.
Right.
Right. Like that you never know. I mean, I think one of the things, and we'll see, there's so many different aspects that are spilling out from these protests, but something that is very encouraging and very important is that, as people always say, like Minneapolis, hey, they did all this stuff. They did the sweeping kind of basic reform packages several years ago. It has not solved the problem. And, America across the board, I always want to remind people of this. Absolutely as an example, like the numbers in Chicago in terms of the just it's not mind blowing. More and more people are recognizing this, but the aggressive racism of policing in Chicago, like something like 70% of shooting fatalities are African Americans, 70% of stops are African Americans. Then you can actually expand it across the country, and you can start including, like, as I always say, that some of the highest places of police fatalities are Alaska, Oklahoma, and New Mexico. And that, obviously brings the class dimension into it. And the reason I point this out is that, number one of the things that's been amazing about these protests is they're taking place everywhere, across the country. And second, I think people are not willing to be satisfied with, sure, yeah, ban chokeholds. You should. If I was in Congress, I'd vote for that. But that's not what we're talking about here.
Right. It has to be far more.
Yes. It has to be way more systemic and aggressive.
And just restructuring. In Hudson, New York, cut the police budget by 10%, not hiring any more officers. Albuquerque, increasing the police budget, but also creating an apparatus to deal with unhoused folks and folks dealing with mental issues that hopefully hopefully what it does is it leads to like less reason to have a bigger police budget as you go forward. I mean, I you know,
Absolutely.
who knows the mechanisms in which it would take to get there, but sometimes I think creating um, alternate entities to begin to alleviate parts of that police portfolio is your first step to actually shrinking the the budgets for these for the police departments. But
I agree completely, because I think
not leaving the police department is a good thing in that respect.
I completely agree with that, because I do think the overall problem here is that the police are assigned to terrorize and monitor and otherwise surveil the populations that we've decided that we're going to discard in the modern, in the economy. So I mean, literally, it's a direct answer by starting to say the answer here is things like housing. I also want to say, I mean, Shama Sawant is putting some very material, concrete things on the ground in Seattle, including working to like ban tear gas, which seems pretty obvious. And that one, I think her work there is also really significant. Did you ever read or watch Men Who Stare at Goats?
No.
Very bizarre.
Good book.
It's a good book. I mean, it's true. It's like about basically all of these. The kind of comedic part is this deep interest in the Pentagon and in the intelligence community in like New Age warfare in the 70s and 80s. So there's like Pentagon guys trying to like run through walls and stuff. And on the other, and then maybe some stuff that, I think it's cool if everybody meditates or whatever. But there's this whole other line of it, of these guys studying, like they were studying non-lethal warfare, basically. And the concrete stuff all of a sudden that this new age thing translated to was a whole bunch of incredibly brutal crowd control weapons that are deployed. Sound, shocks,
and stuff like that.
Yeah. So it actually turned into very real, and there's a big private security industry business with that stuff as well. So I thought of that with made me think of that. But basically just how some of these technical fixes can, it's like,